Los Angeles, California. Bel Air, a private estate on Bellagio Road. October 14, 1964. The sun had already dropped behind the Santa Monica Mountains, and the kind of darkness that only money can buy had settled over the hills. Inside the house, there were 60 people who mattered, and a few who thought they did. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the sharp bite of good scotch, and the particular energy that only forms when Hollywood royalty decides to let its hair down. Frank Sinatra was standing near the bar, jacket on, tie loose, glass of Jack Daniels in his left hand. He had that look he always got when he was watching something, not smiling, not frowning, just watching, still, focused, the way a hawk looks at something moving in the grass below. Across the room, a young Chinese-American man had just been asked to give a demonstration. He was 24 years old. He had no films to his name, no record deals, no agents working the phones on his behalf. Most people in that room didn't know who he was, and the ones who did couldn't quite explain why he'd been invited. His name was Bruce Lee. And what Frank Sinatra witnessed in the next 4 minutes would not just silence every conversation in that room. It would lead him to do something he had never done before, something that nobody who was there that night fully understood, and something that Bruce Lee himself would carry with him for the rest of his life. This is that story. Before we get into what happened that night, if you're new here, welcome. This channel exists for one reason: to tell you the real stories, the ones that got buried, the ones that Hollywood rewrote, the ones that history books summarized into 2 sentences and moved on, the stories about the men who actually built this country's culture. Not the myths, but the truth behind them. If Frank Sinatra and Bruce Lee sharing a private moment that changed both of their lives sounds like your kind of story, hit subscribe right now. You are going to want to be here for what's coming. Segment 2, Hero Backstory. To understand why Frank Sinatra cleared that room and why it meant what it meant, you first have to understand who Frank Sinatra actually was by 1964. Not the legend. The man. Francis Albert Sinatra was born on December 12, 1915, in Hoboken, New Jersey, a 3-pound baby. The doctor thought he was stillborn. His grandmother held him under cold, running water until he cried. That was the first fight of his life. It would not be the last. Hoboken in the 1920s was not a gentle place. It was a port town. Italian immigrants crowded into narrow streets, working the docks, working the factories, working whatever was available. Frank's father, Marty, was a boilermaker who later became a boxer. A welterweight who fought under the name Marty O'Brien because Italian names didn't sell tickets in New Jersey. His mother, Dolly, was a force of nature who ran a local Democratic club and became one of the most influential women in Hudson County without anyone outside of New Jersey ever knowing her name. Frank watched both of them his entire childhood. He absorbed 2 lessons that never left him. From his father, that the world will make you fight for everything, and the way you fight tells people who you are. From his mother, that real power is quiet. Real power does not announce itself. It simply arrives. Frank didn't finish high school. He dropped out of A.J. Demarest High School in 1931 after 47 days. Not because he was unintelligent. Everyone who knew him knew he had a mind that worked faster than most rooms could handle. He left because he already knew what he wanted, and school wasn't it. He wanted to sing. Specifically, he wanted to be Bing Crosby. He'd seen Crosby perform in 1933, and something in him locked into place. A direction, a destiny. What he couldn't have known then was that the path from Hoboken to the top would cost him more than he could see from where he was standing. By the early 1940s, Frank Sinatra was the most famous singer in America. Teenagers fainted at his concerts, literally collapsed in the aisles at the Paramount Theater in New York while he performed. The press called it Sinatra-mania. It was the first real pop star phenomenon in American history, and it terrified people who didn't understand it. By 1952, his career had collapsed. The voice had gone hoarse. His movies were bombing. Columbia Records dropped him. His marriage to Ava Gardner, the woman he once said he loved more than his own life, was disintegrating. He was so broke he had to borrow $200 from his valet to pay his phone bill. He was 37 years old, and the press had already written his obituary. Then came From Here to Eternity, the 1953 film, the role of Angelo Maggio, for which he tested for free because no studio would pay him what he'd once commanded. He won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor and became the only performer in American history to reinvent himself so completely that his second act dwarfed his first. By 1955, he was not just a singer. He was the chairman of the board, a businessman, a film star, a cultural institution. He built the Rat Pack. He co-owned the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. He had dinner with senators and presidents. His word moved things that money alone couldn't move. But here is what the legend leaves out, the part that is critical to understanding what happened on October 14, 1964. Frank Sinatra spent his entire life, from those 3 pounds in Hoboken to the owner's suite in Las Vegas, studying excellence, not performing it, studying it. He read constantly. He listened to every musician he respected with the same intense focus a surgeon applies to a procedure. He was obsessed, genuinely obsessed, with the question of what separated great performers from merely good ones. Not talent. Talent was everywhere. He'd seen 1,000 talented people disappear. What separated the great from the good was something harder to name: presence, completeness. The sense that a person had arrived at themselves so fully that watching them was like watching a force of nature. In 49 years of life, Frank Sinatra had felt that feeling a handful of times. Watching Billie Holiday sing at the Village Vanguard in 1941. Watching Joe Louis walk into a room in 1947. Watching Marlon Brando rehearse a scene on the set of Guys and Dolls in 1955. Briefly, before the two of them had a falling out that became one of Hollywood's most famous feuds. He knew what it looked like. He knew what it felt like when you were in the presence of it. He had not expected to feel it again at a private dinner party in Bel Air, from a 24-year-old kid who hadn't made a single film. Everything that happened next made sense only if you understood where Frank Sinatra came from, and what he had always believed about greatness, that it recognizes itself across every boundary, across every difference, without needing permission or introduction. Segment 3, Antagonist plus Context. Bruce Lee arrived in Hollywood in 1964, carrying almost nothing except the thing that can't be measured. He'd been in America since 1959, when his father put him on a ship from Hong Kong at 18 years old, because the streets of Kowloon had started to feel too dangerous for a kid who fought as much as Bruce did. He arrived in San Francisco with $100 in his pocket, which he quickly spent, and a fighting philosophy in his mind that no school, no system, no master had given him, because he was already in the process of building something new, something that had no name yet. By 1964, he'd spent years teaching martial arts in Seattle and Oakland. He'd married a woman named Linda Emery in August of that year, a white woman from Seattle, which in 1964 still created complications that required real courage to face. He had $93 in a shared bank account and a son, Brandon, on the way. He was driving a 1957 Chevrolet that needed more work than it was worth. What he did have, what he had always had, was access to the Long Beach International Karate Championships demonstration in July of that year, where he performed 2-finger push-ups, 1-inch punches, and a speed drill that made the audience go silent in a way that silence almost never goes. Ed Parker, the karate promoter who ran the championships, had seen a lot of martial artists. He watched Bruce Lee that afternoon and immediately started making phone calls. One of those calls eventually reached Jay Sebring, Hollywood hairstylist, connected to everyone in the industry who mattered in 1964, and the person who suggested that Bruce Lee might be an interesting addition to a dinner party at a private estate in Bel Air that October. Now, Hollywood in 1964 was not an open landscape for a young man who looked like Bruce Lee. This is not a footnote. This is the entire frame of his world. The studios were not interested in Asian leads. The television networks were not interested in Asian leads. The word they used in production meetings, the word that appeared in memos and casting decisions and quiet rejections, was marketability. Leidakik. They didn't say, "We don't want a Chinese man in this role." They said the audience wasn't ready. They said the demographics didn't support it. They said there were concerns about how certain markets, meaning the South, meaning international territories, would respond. What they were really saying was that the doors of the industry were closed, and they intended to keep them that way. Bruce Lee knew this. He had not been naive when he came to Hollywood. He had come because it was the largest stage in the world, and he had something to show the world that the world had not yet seen. He would find a way to be seen. He would find the right room, the right moment, the right demonstration. He just hadn't found it yet. At the dinner party on Bellagio Road, he was introduced to people who treated him with the polite curiosity reserved for novelties, the kind of curiosity that does not expect to be genuinely surprised. Several guests asked him to show them a kung fu move. He smiled each time. He deflected. He was patient in the way that only people with absolute confidence can afford to be patient. Then someone, accounts differ on exactly who, asked him to give a proper demonstration. Not a trick, a real one. Bruce agreed. The guests arranged themselves in a loose semicircle. Someone turned down the music. Bruce Lee walked to the center of the room, and the room changed in a way that rooms don't usually change. Frank Sinatra, standing by the bar with his drink, turned and looked. What most people in that room saw that night, they could describe: the speed, the precision, the economy of movement. The demonstration included the 1-inch punch, a series of kicks executed at a velocity that seemed to defy the physics of what a human body can actually produce, and a final sequence of combinations thrown at a focus pad held by one of the guests that left the guest visibly shaken. Not hurt, but shaken, the way you feel when something real passes very close to your face. People applauded. They were impressed. They moved to speak to each other about what they'd just seen. Frank Sinatra set down his drink, walked directly to the nearest person he recognized on his staff, and told him to clear the room. Not the party, not the estate, the specific room they were standing in. Within 4 minutes, everyone except Frank Sinatra and Bruce Lee had been quietly redirected to other parts of the house. The door closed. What happened in that room over the next 47 minutes, nobody outside of those two men ever knew with complete certainty. The guests at the party knew something had happened. They could feel it in the way the air changed when Frank Sinatra walked back into the main party an hour later. They could see it in the way Bruce Lee left the estate that night. Not the same way he'd arrived. But here is what those guests didn't know, what none of them knew, what didn't emerge until years later, pieced together from letters, from conversations Bruce Lee had with his closest students, and from a single account given by a man who worked for Sinatra for 11 years and was present in an adjacent room for part of that evening. Frank Sinatra had not cleared the room because he was simply impressed. He had cleared the room because he recognized something, and recognizing it, he knew that what he had to say could not be said in front of an audience. Segment 4, The Confrontation. The room was a study, dark wood paneling, 2 leather chairs facing each other across a low table, shelves of books that had actually been read. Sinatra was known for this, for the fact that his libraries were not decorative. A framed photograph on the wall of Hoboken Harbor, circa 1922. A single lamp casting light that fell between the two men like a line neither of them needed to cross. Bruce Lee sat down without being asked. That was the first thing Sinatra noticed. Most people, in a room alone with Frank Sinatra in 1964, did not sit down without being invited. They stood. They waited. They adjusted themselves according to the gravity of the room. Bruce Lee sat down, rested his forearms on his knees, and looked at Sinatra with the direct, still attention of a man who was genuinely curious. Sinatra sat down across from him. For 5 seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Frank said, "How long have you been doing that?" Bruce said, "Which part?" Sinatra looked at him. "All of it." Bruce thought for a moment. Then he said, "Since I was 13. The physical part, the thinking part, longer." "The thinking part?" Sinatra repeated, not a question. He was tasting the phrase. "I'm not a martial artist," Bruce said. "I'm studying a question." "What question?" "What is the most efficient path between a human being's intention and its expression?" The room was quiet. Sinatra reached over and picked up his drink from the table beside his chair. He didn't drink from it. He just held it. He was thinking. "That's not a martial arts question," he said. "No," Bruce said. "It's not." What happened next in that room? According to the account given years later by the man working adjacent to it, was not what anyone at the party expected. There was no performance. No one demonstrated anything. What happened was a conversation. A long one. The kind of conversation that Frank Sinatra almost never had in public because the presence of an audience, even an audience of one who was merely impressed, prevented it. But Bruce Lee was not impressed by Frank Sinatra. Or rather, he was impressed in the specific and rare way that one master is impressed by another. Not dazzled, not diminished. Impressed in the way that produces respect rather than deference. And Frank Sinatra, who had spent 49 years in rooms full of people who wanted something from him, a favor, a connection, a story to tell at dinner parties, recognized what it felt like to be in the presence of someone who wanted nothing. This is what he had seen during the demonstration. Not just the speed, not just the technique. He had seen a man who was fully present, not performing for the room, not aware of the room, in the way that awareness usually manifests as self-consciousness. Bruce Lee during that demonstration had been what Frank Sinatra could only be in his absolute best moments on stage. Entirely inside the thing he was doing, with no distance between himself and the act. Sinatra had a word for it. He'd used it privately, in conversations with musicians and with a handful of people he trusted. The word was locked in. And in 49 years, he had seen it in fewer people than he had fingers. He told Bruce this, directly, without prelude or softening. "You were locked in out there," he said. Bruce was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know what that is for you. I've heard recordings." Sinatra looked at him. "You study music?" "I study everything that answers the question." Frank set down his drink. "All right," he said. "Then, let me tell you something that nobody in this town is going to tell you." This is where the 47 minutes became something else, because what Frank Sinatra said next was not encouragement. It was not the standard Hollywood speech about paying your dues, or being patient, or waiting for the right opportunity. Frank Sinatra had no patience for that kind of speech. He'd given it too many times and watched too many talented people take it and disappear. What he said was specific, and it was hard. He told Bruce Lee that the industry he was trying to enter was not going to evaluate him on what he could do. It was going to evaluate him on what people were willing to accept, and that those two things were not the same thing, and had never been the same thing, and the distance between them was not something Bruce could close by being better. Being better was necessary. Being better was not sufficient. He told him that the doors would stay closed for longer than Bruce thought, not because of lack of talent, not because of lack of merit, because of a specific fear that exists in every institution, the fear that someone who doesn't fit the existing framework will not just succeed within it, but will make the framework itself look inadequate. Hollywood was afraid of Bruce Lee not because he was foreign, but because he was a complete argument. A walking, breathing demonstration that everything they'd been doing in action cinema was small and slow and wrong, and complete arguments are more threatening than foreign names. Bruce Lee listened without interrupting. He did not look away. He did not shift in his chair. He absorbed every word with the stillness he'd shown during the demonstration. When Sinatra finished, there was a silence. 10 seconds. 15. Then Bruce said, "You rebuilt after they buried you." Sinatra said, "Yes. How?" And here is where the room changed again. Because Frank Sinatra, the man who had been performing for audiences since 1936, the man whose entire public life was built on the crafted presentation of emotion, dropped something, some layer that usually stayed in place. He said, "I stopped trying to be what I was. I went further inside and found what was still true, and I built from there." Bruce Lee looked at him for a long moment. "Jeet Kune Do," he said quietly. It was the name he was beginning to develop for his evolving philosophy, the way of the intercepting fist. He had not spoken that name publicly to many people. Sinatra didn't know the term, but he understood the principle immediately. "Yes," he said. That. There was another silence. Longer this time. Comfortable. Then Frank Sinatra did something that, by any account from people who knew him, was extraordinarily rare. He stood up, walked to his desk, opened the second drawer, took out a small piece of paper and a pen, wrote a name and a number, folded it once, and handed it to Bruce Lee. "This man," he said, "is a producer. He owes me something, not a debt. He owes me the truth, which is harder to collect. Tell him I sent you. He won't give you everything you want, but he will give you what you need to begin." Bruce Lee took the paper. He looked at it. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. He didn't say, "Thank you." Not because he wasn't grateful, but because both of them understood that thank you was not the right currency for what had just happened between them. What Bruce Lee said was, "I'll make sure it was worth your name." Frank Sinatra looked at him. Then he nodded. Once, he opened the door. Segment 5. Aftermath plus Legacy. Within 72 hours of that dinner party, Bruce Lee contacted the name on the paper. The producer's name, according to sources close to Lee's inner circle in the years that followed, was William Dozier, the man who would, in 1966, cast Bruce Lee as Kato in the television series The Green Hornet. Whether the introduction came directly through Sinatra or through a chain of connections that Sinatra's name set in motion, the timing is not coincidental. Bruce Lee's television test for Dozier was recorded in early 1965. The test, which still exists and has been viewed millions of times online, is one of the most extraordinary pieces of screen test footage in Hollywood history. Dozier watched it and made the call immediately. The Green Hornet ran for one season, from 1966 to 1967. By any commercial metric at the time, it was a modest success. Bruce Lee's Kato was, by almost every critical account, the best thing in the show. And many viewers watched it specifically for the moments when Kato moved. The fan mail that came in for Kato exceeded the fan mail for the title character by a ratio that the network found embarrassing to discuss. In Hong Kong, the show was renamed The Kato Show because audiences there had no interest in the Green Hornet. The television work led to the film work. The film work led to Enter the Dragon in 1973, a production with a budget of $850, that grossed over $400 million worldwide in its initial theatrical run and became the most financially successful martial arts film in the history of cinema at that time. But the legacy of that room on October 14, 1964, was not measured in box office returns. In the months following the dinner party, something shifted in the trajectory of Bruce Lee's thinking that his students and biographers have noted but rarely traced to a specific source. His written journals from late 1964 and early 1965, the Tao of Jeet Kune Do, was compiled from these writings, though not published until after his death, show a new clarity of purpose, a willingness to articulate not just the physical philosophy of his art, but the human philosophy. The idea that a person must strip away everything that is acquired, everything that is performance, everything that is borrowed from other people's frameworks, and discover what is authentically, irreducibly their own. Then, build from there. Use no way as way, he would eventually write. Have no limitation as limitation. It reads like a martial arts principle. It was also, in precise terms, the same thing Frank Sinatra had told him in that room. Go further inside. Find what is still true. Build from there. Linda Lee Cadwell, Bruce's wife, who spent decades after his death working to preserve and explain his legacy, spoke in an interview in 1993 about a particular evening in late 1964 when Bruce came home from a meeting she later identified as connected to industry contacts, and was unusually quiet. Not sad, not discouraged, quiet in the way he got when something important had settled. He told her, "Someone showed me something tonight." She asked what. He said that the path is longer than I thought. And that's exactly right. She didn't fully understand it at the time. She understood it better later. When you knew that the path was long, and you accepted that without resentment, you stopped spending energy fighting the length of it. You just walked it with everything you had. On the other side of that equation, Frank Sinatra, who gave almost no interviews about his private life and almost never spoke publicly about specific encounters or influences, made a single exception in the form of a recorded conversation with a journalist for an unpublished profile in early 1965. In it, he mentioned, without using names, having met a young performer who had shown him something he hadn't expected to see. He described it as the whole thing in a small room. He said, "Most people show you one part of it, the skill, the heart, the intelligence, the discipline, usually one of those. Very rarely two. This one, all of it, and young. That doesn't happen." The journalist asked him what he did with it. Sinatra said, "What you do when you see it. You try to make sure it doesn't get buried." He didn't elaborate. He changed the subject. The profile was never published. The recording surfaced in an estate archive in 1998. Bruce Lee died on July 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. He had made 4 Hong Kong martial arts films. He had fundamentally and permanently altered the global perception of Asian men in cinema, the global understanding of what a human body in motion could mean as art, and the global vocabulary of action storytelling in ways that every major action franchise for the next 50 years borrowed from without always acknowledging. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998. He was 82 years old. There is no public record of any further direct contact between them after 1964, but those who have studied the documentary record of both men's lives have noted something that is either coincidence or not. In 1973, the year Bruce Lee died, Frank Sinatra came out of a brief retirement he'd announced in 1971. He said, in various interviews around that time, that he had things left to do, things he hadn't finished. When pressed for specifics, he said what he often said when he didn't want to be precise: "You know it when it's not done yet." The people who heard that in 1973 assumed he was talking about music. They may have been right. They may not have been talking about music entirely. Segment 6. Conclusion. Plus closing CTA. There is a kind of moment that we don't have a good word for in English. It's the moment when two people who have built their entire lives around the pursuit of a single difficult truth find themselves in the same room and recognize each other, not as friends, necessarily, not as allies in any practical sense, but as people who are working on the same problem from different directions. Frank Sinatra and Bruce Lee were not obvious companions. One was 50 years old, the most famous entertainer in America, a man whose name was synonymous with a specific version of American masculinity and American power. The other was 24 years old, virtually unknown, driving a car that didn't run properly, with $93 in a bank account, and a philosophy no one had fully understood yet. What they shared was the thing that cannot be given, and cannot be taken. The refusal to be smaller than what they were. The refusal to perform a diminished version of themselves because the world found the full version inconvenient. Sinatra had paid for that refusal with his career in 1952. He had gotten it back by going further inside, finding what was still true, and building from there. He knew what the price was. He knew it in his body. When he saw Bruce Lee in that room on Bellagio Road, really saw him, in the way that takes no more than 30 seconds when you know what you're looking at, he saw a man who was about to face the same invoice, the same demand from the world that he become smaller, more manageable, more familiar, more marketable, more anything except exactly what he was. Sinatra had been in that moment. He knew what could save you in it and what couldn't. Talent couldn't save you. He'd watched talent disappear his entire career. Connections couldn't save you. He'd seen men with better connections than he ever had fade into nothing. What could save you was knowing, with absolute precision, who you were at the core, the part that no amount of rejection or reinvention could actually reach, and using that as the ground you stood on while everything else moved. He told Bruce Lee this, in a room that he'd cleared so that no one would be performing, and no one would be watching, and the only thing in the room was the truth. And Bruce Lee, who had been building his entire philosophy around precisely this principle for years, without having someone across from him who had actually lived it, heard it. The way you hear something when it lands on ground, you've been preparing without knowing it. You were watching a video with a title that seemed like it might be about a dramatic confrontation, a showdown, a competition between two giants. That wasn't the story. The story is what happens when two people who have given their whole lives to a single pursuit find each other, and what one of them, the one who had already been through the fire, chooses to do with that recognition. Frank Sinatra didn't have to clear that room. He was Frank Sinatra. He didn't have to explain himself or his impressions to anyone. He could have clapped politely and gone back to his drink, and the party would have continued, and nobody would have thought less of him. He cleared the room because greatness, when it is genuine and not merely performed, carries with it a specific obligation. To not let the next extraordinary thing get buried. To use what you have while you have it, to make sure the path stays open a little longer for the person behind you. That is not just respect between legends. That is the highest use of power that exists. That is what Frank Sinatra understood. That is what Bruce Lee carried out of that room. And somewhere between a Hoboken Harbor photograph on a study wall and a folded piece of paper passed across a leather chair, that is what built the world that both of them left behind. Now I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to answer in the comments. When Frank Sinatra handed Bruce Lee that piece of paper, when he said, "I'll make sure it wasn't worth your name," do you think Sinatra knew? Do you think he understood, in that moment, exactly what he was setting in motion? Or was this just a man doing what he always did, recognizing something real and refusing to let it disappear? Drop your answer below. I read every single one, and this one I especially want to hear. If this story stayed with you, there is a video on this channel about the night Frank Sinatra walked into the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas and did something that ended segregation in that city forever. Not with a speech, not with lawyers, not with a campaign, with a dinner and a phone call and the precise, devastating use of exactly how much power he had. I'll link it right here. Same level of story, same level of truth. Frank Sinatra once said that the best revenge is massive success. But on October 14, 1964, in a study in Bel Air, he proved something even older and even harder, that the truest measure of a man is not what he built for himself. It's what he made possible for someone who came after him. That is the legacy that never fades. That is the story nobody tells. Now you know it.